So we're going to start out just in the main Our Writer window, and it's simplistic as far as inventory is concerned as if we went up, for example, to the icon that says Quick Part at the top of the screen. I'm going to put in my part number. It's a 21334. And then either hit the Enter key on the keyboard or click Search. And as it searches my master inventory, you'll notice that a 21334 with a line code of SFI is an oil filter with a cost of $1.82, 3 of them on my shelf, and then also $5.99 as my selling price. So how we manage the on-hand, the costs, as well as the selling price are all parts of today's conversation in terms of looking at managing your inventory. Or if we're going to use the catalog, so for example, let's pick on my friend Jennifer Quinn down here. If we're going to add an oil change onto her transaction, as I go through my SmartyCat catalog, this is true with any of the catalog integrations that look back into Our Writer for both pricing and availability, but if we were to go through and add an oil change onto her transaction, when we get to the window where we're going to search for the filter, the cost, and the sell, as well as the on-hand or the availability piece, are all going to be driven by the information that's in my inventory. I'm going to close back out of here, hit the X in the upper right-hand corner, to lead from there 2 other pieces, and we'll talk about them as we go through today's conversation as to why managing our inventory is relevant. The first would be the inventory can tell us how much we own, meaning I've got a bunch of parts that are out on my shelf. I want to know, well, exactly what is that stock worth, and inventory and managing our inventory correctly will help us determine that value, as well as how much do I owe, meaning that inventory had to come from somewhere, tracking it through accounts payable and making sure that we're seeing the numbers that out on the other side can also be managed through our inventory module. So on the left-hand side of the toolbar, there's an icon there that says Inventory. I'm going to go ahead and click on that Inventory icon. As I do, it takes me out to my Inventory module. During today's conversation, we're going to focus primarily on the icons to the right of the Inventory icon. In a webinar that we hosted just a couple of weeks ago, we talked about both the View Add Edit function as well as the Inventory Entry function underneath this Inventory menu. To the right of that, we've got a number of different icons. Again, we'll touch on just about every one of these over the course of the next 40 minutes or so. However, the quote return and part return topics are actually part of the webinar we've got scheduled upcoming, so we're also going to bypass those as part of today's conversation. Before we stick in our inventory module for the balance of our conversation, however, there are some configurable settings that come into play that we will see as we go through our conversation today. So before we spend time in inventory, I'm going to jump back over to Our Writer for just a moment, open up the configuration module. And once I'm in the configuration module, the specific window that we're heading towards is under configuration, down to parts, and then towards the very bottom, there's actually 2 items here: PO transfer and other parts options, and inventory adjustments descriptions. We're going to talk about PO transfer and other parts options here now. We'll come back to inventory adjustment descriptions when we get into the adjustments icon here a little later on in this conversation. PO transfer and other parts options is a window that can allow us to define some of the behavior as we're using the various tools in inventory. For example, prompt for changes when posting PO, PO standing for purchase order. So we're going to go through and we're going to post a purchase order during our conversation this afternoon. And when we do, we're going to have the system prompt us to enter an AP transaction. If I'd like it to also have the prompt for price changes, when a cost gets modified, should it change the cell, we could do that as well. We could also change the primary suppliers. I usually buy this part from X, but this time I bought it from Y. Do I want Y to now be the primary supplier for this part from this point forward? Apply ordering rules based on package quantity and minimum order quantity. We'll get into the View Add Edit function in inventory during our conversation today, and we will talk a little bit about package quantity and minimum order quantity. What this really does is if the vendor sells the goods or sells the part as part of a case good, let's say 12 to a package, and they will not ship individual units, so make sure that we're always ordering in units of 12, be it 12, 24, 36. So we will apply our package quantity and or minimum order quantity rules as we go through. As we continue to the right, disable editing purchase order in AP. Again, this impacts not just inventory, but accounts payable as well, whether or not we're going to enter in a purchase order number, and or primarily this part is, or this configuration setting is driven by, as we're posting an AP transaction, back over to a ticket, whether or not we use the invoice number as the PO number as we're making that post. Pre-select AP payment type, we'll see this happen as well as we go through our accounts payable posting. We'll see that it's already pre-established that I have a charge account for the majority of my vendors, so there's my pre-selected AP payment type. We're going to create an AP transaction when we're posting a purchase order. We're going to always do that. See that happen as we post our PO. The cores, if there are any, are going to go into cores, the cores bucket as our account, not only for accounting integration perspective, but also as a detail of expenses by account report, for example. The next purchase order number, again, this will just increment sequentially as we go along. And last but not least, ignore on-order parts when displaying on-hand inventory quantities. Only affects these features. Now, if you look to the these features list, it's a fairly significant list. Quick parts, the Epicor catalog, SmartShop, SmartyCat, and Smart eJobs, meaning if I'm in our writer, and if I have that box unchecked and I go to Quick Part, when I search here, the on-hand value that it shows me will either be just my true on-hand minus my committed, or it will also include my on-order. So if we look to this setting here, if I have this box checked, then the system only shows us the on-hand minus the committed, versus if it's unchecked, then it sum totals the on-hand as well as the on-order to determine what our available for sale would be in that window. This bottom section is really a legacy setting. It was introduced, or it was part of the system back when we first introduced true line code functionality in version 1.12. What I mean by that is every part inside of our writer is a combination of a part number and a line code, meaning I could have 10 different part numbers that are all 21334 in my system as long as the line code was different. That then creates or generates a unique part record. Prior to version 1.12, which again we're going back to say 2003, 2004, somewhere in there, prior to that version, we didn't use part number and line code, we just used part number itself as a unique record. So as we started to introduce the line code functionality, we gave end users a way that they could wheel through their master inventory and update the line code, and also potentially update the line code on historical part sales, open purchase orders, and so on and so forth, other various sort of places in the system where we deal with a part number. So that's really what this setting down here at the bottom is. I would tell you that really hasn't been relevant for quite some time since we introduced version 1.12. Again, I would advise you to just leave it set as is to the save part record only and not worry too much about the other options. They're, again, no longer relevant. So leaving configuration for just a moment, getting back over into inventory, we're going to skip over the browse function. We'll talk about that towards the end of our conversation this afternoon, and we're going to go over to post receipts. So as we're going through and we're looking at our inventory on hand values, there's really 4 different ways that we can adjust those values. We can use the post receipts function to tell the system we've received a part. We can make an adjustment once we've done a cycle count to adjust the on hand to whatever its accurate number should be. We can receive a purchase order, meaning I order the parts from a vendor, the vendor's delivered them to me. I'd like to receive the purchase order, and then last but not least, we can go ahead and we can post transfers. So if we've got more than one location, we're going to move parts from one to another. So really 4 different ways that we can impact the on-hand through the inventory module. Of course, as we're selling parts, that's impacting the on-hand as well. But for our purposes, we're looking at how we do that through inventory. We're going to start out with post receipts. So I come into the post receipts window, and I want to go ahead and I want to adjust the on-hand quantity of an oil filter in my system, meaning I've ordered a part, I called up my local vendor and I said, hey, send me down a half a dozen of this particular filter number. So if I went into the system and I typed in the filter number, and after I type in the number, I either hit the enter key on the keyboard, or at the bottom of this window I click on search INV. Either one goes and looks at my master inventory to determine whether or not it is a recognized part. Once I find the part number in my parts list, I just hit the enter key again. And once I get back to this window here, all I do is it's just a matter of simply keying in the quantity I've received. I received 2 of these. So as soon as I click on OK, it's going to increment my on-hand by a factor of 2. Notice there is a new cost, there is a new average cost. Over here on the right-hand side, my average cost is $1.49. My primary vendor cost is $1.48. Really, I say this is last acquisition cost. What I mean by that is, if I bought 10 of these filters and they cost me $1 a piece, then my average cost would be $1, as well as my primary vendor cost would be $1 as well. If tomorrow I bought 10 more from the same vendor, this time they cost $2 a piece, now my average cost would be $1.50 because I've got 10 that I bought for $10 and 10 that I bought for $20. So I have 20 which I bought for $30. So again, $1.50 being my average cost. My primary vendor cost would be $2. That was my last acquisition cost from this vendor. So as we're looking at the part, creating future purchase orders, the system uses the last vendor cost in order to determine, or my primary vendor cost, in order to determine what the appropriate price on the purchase order would be. At current, there's no core associated with this part, and $5.99 is the selling price. If I said, well, I received 2, and as opposed to being $1.48, they were $2. Well, then it says, well, now your average cost for for these would be $1.57. I own 12 of them at $1.49, 2 of them at $2. So therefore, that averages out to, in this case, $1.57. Napa is my primary supplier, so it's pre-populated in the lower right-hand corner. All I'll do is click on OK. If I wanted to continue down that path, I could simply put in part number, quantity received, and then once I click on OK, it's now incrementing my inventory. Now I will say this, Post Receipts works very well. It's a very easy way to go ahead and add parts into our inventory as we're going along. However, if you're using accounts payable, then we should never use Post Receipts in the inventory module. And I say that because as I've gone through and I've posted these receipts into my inventory, you'll notice at no point did it create an AP transaction for any of these parts, meaning even though I'm saying I'm receiving these from Napa, I'm not telling the system that I actually owe Napa for these parts. So if you will, take a mental snapshot of this window, this post parts receipt function in inventory, because if we're using accounts payable, we want to use that same functionality. If I clicked on Post AP, or if I went through my accounts payable module to get to my accounts payable posting window, when I do that, I want to first define who the supplier is, and we'll stick with Napa as my supplier, the invoice number, and we'll put in just NAP123 as the invoice. There's my default payment type of charge, as we saw in our configuration window. The lower right-hand corner, we'll click on Next, and in this case, we're going to post something to inventory. So I click on Inventory, and if we'll pick on that same 21334 part number, and we're going to say that we've received 3 of those. Again, the cost can stay where it is. It's adjusting my average cost, but my total for this would be $6. If I click on OK, what you'll notice is it leads in my AP posting window. So as I continue to post parts from this particular receipt from my friends over at Napa, we got 4 more of those. I click on OK. Once I've continued or finished entering in all the parts that we've received, I simply hit Post, and then now it'll want my purchase order number. Again, I can't edit that there based upon our configurable setting, but I put a purchase order number in, click on OK, and it gives me the option, the ability to print my AP invoice. Again, if I was printing an AP invoice, I'd likely staple it to the packing slip for the parts that we received on this purchase order, put it aside with my daily paperwork. In our case, we'll answer no to the question of printing that invoice, but if you notice, again, the exact same window that we saw in inventory through the post receipts function, the only difference being, and in this case, we're posting an AP transaction. We're telling the system, hey, not only do we buy something, but here's who we owe for it, and here's how much we owe. So back over to inventory again, that exact same window through accounts payable. If you're using Post AP, and my recommendation is don't use Post Receipts in this window here, because it will not create that accounts payable transaction. But so we can post receipts, whether we're doing it here or through Post AP into my inventory, as one means to manage and or adjust my inventory. Now, once we're done with that, over on the very right-hand icon in the inventory module, it says Reports. I bring up my Reports menu towards the bottom. At the very last, but 3 up from the top is a parts receipt report. If I were to print this report, and again, we'll select today's date range as the defined range for the report, and then click on OK, what you'll find is that this report essentially just prints out all of that behavior, all those different receipts that we've made. And I've made a few before we started today, but so we can see as we go through, there's both the 334 and the 040, the two oil filters that we just adjusted on this particular date. So tied to that post-receipt functionality, and it doesn't matter whether we do it through accounts payable or direct through inventory, is this parts receipt report. Cancel back out of there because we've posted our receipts, we've bought some parts from a vendor, so now the system has an on-hand value inside of it. Every so often, we want to go out and we want to cycle count our inventory, meaning we want to count and see whether or not what is in the system matches against what's on my shelf. So there's an icon there that says adjustments. So before we get to adjustments, we'll start out with, I'm going to actually go out and do an inventory count. Underneath reports, there's an option there that says inventory list. Now in our case, we're going to do it just for oil filters. So I'm going to go down to where it says filters-oil. And once I select filters-oil, we'll do just parts where my on-hand is greater than 0. So I set my filter criteria as we go through. I'm going to click on print. So I can print my inventory list. It's going to think for just a moment and eventually give me my print dialog box where I'll print that thing to the screen. And once we print it to the screen, then now we can see here's our inventory list. So if I was heading out to count those parts, then again, here's my part number, my line code, my description, and then here's how many I have on hand, how many are already on invoices as committed parts, and then here's my total count. So again, we use the inventory list as our means to go ahead and count the parts that are in our system. Once we find a discrepancy, then we come back in here and we would make our adjustment. So for example, I've got an M844 oil filter on this report, which if I follow along, it says I've got 2 of them on my shelf. We just went through and we counted. We found that we actually had 3. And if I came back over here into adjustments, and again, if I said put in my password, and then M844 is my part number, once I do my search, it says, well, is that the M844 or the M8445 oil filter? In this case, the 844 was the one with the discrepancy. So I simply click on OK, and I change my on-hand. So in this case, we'll make my on-hand 3 for that part. Down beneath that is an adjustment description. The adjustment description is only relevant on the printed report, meaning after we're done talking about adjustments, we'll go look at what reporting is available in regards. And on that report, it's going to designate, well, here's why I made that adjustment. In this case, I went from 2 to 3. So missing not necessarily the appropriate adjustment. If I changed it down and said, well, you know what, it was on the shelf when I didn't expect it to be. So we're going to click on OK. It will record on shelf as the reason for my adjustment. The adjustment description, again, only matters as we're looking at a report. If that's not necessarily an applicable value, then you can just leave it as is. Just change your quantity as you enter your part number into the system. Before we go too much further, though, however, this adjustment description is user definable. If I came back over into the configuration module, click on cancel to close out of there. Underneath configuration, we're going to go down to parts again and down to inventory adjustment descriptions. And in this window here, again, this would be where I'd enter in or I'd change or modify my drop-down list of inventory adjustment descriptions. Simply enter in the adjustment code and the adjustment description, click on Save. Now we've added a new adjustment description into my drop-down list. Click on Cancel or OK to close back out of there, and I'm going to jump back over to inventory because it's simply part number, line code, on hand, OK. And then if I move down to the next one, I could go ahead and I could change my part number and I could change my line code. And I'm sorry, I can select my part number and line code and then change my on-hand quantity. We'll click on OK. So again, adjustments are not that dramatic, but it's just part number, verify you've got the right line code, and then adjust your on-hand. Once I'm done doing my adjustments, over on the right-hand side where it says reports, it's actually called the lost stock report. I pulled this one up and again hit print, leaving today as the suggested or selected date. When I go ahead and send that over to the printer or print that to the screen, there it is. There's my M844 where we've just made that adjustment again. There's your adjustment reason that it recorded as well. So when I said you found that or you see that on a report, that's where that adjustment reason comes into play. To close back out of that report there, so again, we talked about 4 different ways in inventory to adjust your on-hand quantities. We've now gone through part receipts as well as we've gone through adjustments. The next one over is PO management. So in PO management, this is where we would manage our open purchase orders. So if, say, for example, I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to create an order to send to my battery supplier, and I've got one out there for Interstate, we're going to create a second. Let me get rid of that one there, not one that we're going to receive against. So I want to create one for Interstate, and I want to tell it what batteries we're going to order. There's really 2 different ways to create a PO, either an auto build, which we're going to skip over here for just a moment, or a manual build. So I'll create a manual build. I'll let it assign my next sequential PO number, and I'll drop my window down through my suppliers until I find Interstate as my supplier. I click on OK. Then a manual build is just that. We're going to tell the system, here is what we're going to order. So I'll click on Add Part. Part number is going to be 27-A. It says, all right, here's the part number that we're looking to order. In this case, I simply select it. I define the number that we're going to order, and then click on OK. With a manual build, you just simply add the parts onto the purchase order that you'd like to submit to order from the vendor. So there is no limit, there is no minimum in terms of the number of parts that we're going to order. We simply continue using the add part functionality to include or add parts onto my transaction. So you have a manual build and you have an auto build. Now an auto build is a little bit smarter in that auto build uses a min-max stocking parameter in order to determine exactly what should be stocked on your shelf. Before we start our auto build, we go into inventory, view, add, edit, and look at exactly what I'm referring to as far as a min-max ordering parameters is considered. If I said, well, let's see, let's look for part number 21334 inside of my master inventory. And this part here, I've got 2 of them on my shelf. If I looked at it, down here to the right, it says my stock to value is 6, my reorder value is 4. When we run an auto build, it looks at the stock to value, and it compares when the inventory is below the reorder points, and then it will order back up to the stocking level. In this case, it's going to want to order 4 of this particular filter. Now, a couple of other caveats as we considered, that should be considered with an auto build, and that is the left-hand side, it wants to make sure that we're going to order when we select Napa as our supplier. And then towards the bottom, we want to make sure that it's flagged as a stocking part. An auto build will not take into account or order any part that is flagged as non-stock. It would consider stock and or consigned as part of its generation. However, it will not look at a non-stock part. So I clicked on Save, and that'll go ahead and it'll find it. If I look to that 21040, that other oil filter we've been playing around with, again, if you look in this case, the stocking level, which is reorder at 6, stock to 12, I've got 18 of those. So the system is not going to suggest to order this particular part. I'm going to hit the X in the upper right-hand corner, and I'm going to go ahead and let the auto build process begin. I'll click on Napa as my supplier, and as I go through Napa, and then we'll leave all departments configured, I'll click on OK, and the system starts to generate the information about my suggested purchase order. It's going to wheel through my entire inventory. While it does, a couple of more notes in regards to inventory. I'm going to go back out to Quick Part. We'll bring up a 27082 filter, which comes in either the single unit and or the case good. If I looked at the case good down here, if you look in the lower right-hand corner, in my case, I've got 16 of those on my shelf. Stock to 12, reorder at 6. The MOQ is 1, meaning I shouldn't order less than 1 of these. However, the package quantity is 12, meaning the 27082 MP is a master pack oil filters from Napa. They ship them in a case unit of 12. So the package quantity is 12. When it suggests that I order this part, it will order it in units of 12, be it 12, 24, 36, or so on. So MOQ and package quantity, when we looked at that configurable setting back over in PO transfer and other parts options, it said apply ordering rules based upon package quantity and minimum order quantity. It's exactly what it's referring to, is whether or not it will order in the increments we see here. And in this case, we've got an on-hand of greater than our stocking point certainly greater than our reorder value, so therefore our auto build should not or would not include this particular part. Move back down to inventory, and you know what, I didn't have any particular parts, I think in this case, that it wanted to order with my auto build, but once it finished its assessment, it would have given me a list of all of the parts. If a couple of you may have joined me for this morning's conversation, I had a lot more parts that were out of stock this morning, so when I did my auto build, it gave me about 20 or 25 different part numbers that it was looking to order. There we go. Just 2 different part numbers it's looking for me to replenish against for my auto build this afternoon. So it shows me both that 21334 and the 21365 oil filter that it's suggesting to order. Now at this point, you know, we're going to go ahead and we're going to submit this order to our vendor. And we can do it a couple of different ways. Certainly the old school ways of printing a copy of it, faxing it over to the order, and or you could print a copy of it, print it to a PDF, email it over to a vendor, and or if I wanted to send it electronically, when I click on parts, if I was to go ahead and click on e-order right here, this would submit that order electronically to the vendor. So first thing it does is it stock checks to see whether or not they've got it available at our local distribution center. Looks like they're available at the DC, this one available at the parts store and the DC as well. So it does know that I can get those parts. If I'd like to order them electronically, I can go ahead and click on the icon that looks like a truck there and submit it through Smart eOrder, just as if I was ordering a part for a specific transaction. As we look at our purchase order window, we're going to come back and we're going to post this PO in just a moment. However, before we do, while we're waiting for NAPA to deliver us the order, we're going to close out of PO management. And over here in the reporting module, again, there are a couple of different reports that lend themselves to not only the purchase order functionality, but also that specific auto build. Starting with the very first one at the top of the screen is the parts reorder report. The parts reorder report will essentially do exactly what we just did with the auto build. It will look at all of the parts in our inventory to determine where the on-hand value falls below the reorder point, and then determine what would be required to bring us back up to the stocking level. The other one that's in there is what's called the inventory overage report. The inventory overage report will tell us where our current on-hand exceeds the stocking level of a part. So in theory, the part that we had 16 of, where our stocking level is 12, would show up on our inventory overage report because we are 4 units over what our model inventory would be. In this case, or in that case, it was because of the master pack, the case of 12, but it would show us that we are currently exceeding our stocking level for that particular part. So I'm going to leave the reporting menu for just a moment. Go back over to PO management, because while we've been talking about reports, NAPA has pulled the purchase order, thrown all the parts, and brought them over to us. We now want to talk about, well, what do we do when the parts actually show up? I'd like to receive those, make sure I'm incrementing my inventory to include those parts as available. So back into PO management we go. In this window here, again, NAPA is my supplier. Down in the parts tab, we see the 2 parts that we ordered. On the 3rd tab over, it says posting. So in the posting window, in our case, we only have 2 different parts that we were purchasing as part of this PO. So it's not too hard for me to go through and just double click on it. Did we receive 4? Was the cost $2? We click on OK. Same with that second one. Did we receive 8? Is the cost still $1.95? And we click on OK. Now, as an alternative, if we had 30, 40, 50 different parts that were on this purchase order, then what it's also very easy to do is at the top of the screen, there's a button there that says Receive All. All that Receive All does is it takes the value that's in the On Ordered column, puts it into the Received column, assuming that we have received all of the items that were outstanding on this PO. Now, what this allows us to do is to manage the exceptions. And what I mean by that is, if I said receive all, and again, if I had 2, 3, 4, 5 pages of parts on this inventory, and of the, let's say, 100 parts we ordered, I received 98, but I'd simply come back and then say, you know, and I didn't get 8 of these, I just got 4. And oh, by the way, the cost on this is now $2.10 as opposed to $1.95. So we make the purchase order match terms and quantity as well as price, and then towards the upper left, we'll click on Post. Are we sure we wanted to post this purchase order? We'll answer yes to that question. I didn't mean to hit that button. and then it wants me to enter in my vendor invoice number so we can post our accounts payable transaction. Click on Post. It'll give me an opportunity now to print an AP receipt. Again, staple that to our packing list. That way our bookkeeper knows that we posted that into accounts payable. In our case, we'll save the steps of printing it to the screen cancel by clicking on No. Do you want to print a PO receipt? Now we can go into the reporting menu and we can reprint a purchase order from history. So if I'd like to have a line item detail of what parts were received at what dollar amount, I'd answer yes to this question here. If I answered no to this question and wanted one later, then again, the history purchase order receipt would be my report that I could go back and search and reprint any purchase order that was performed over the course of time. I'll answer no to that question. One last question. It says, create a new PO with parts not received from this purchase order. And really what it's saying is your vendor back order? Meaning, if your vendor was going to bring you those 4 filters that I didn't post on the same purchase order number, then we'll answer no to this question because we'd like to leave the existing purchase order as is. I'm going to receive against it again. If the vendor says, you know what, sorry, I didn't have them, so therefore I didn't ship, reorder them if you still would like them whenever you submit your next order, then our answer is going to be yes, because what that will then do, if you watch, this was PO number 107. When I answered yes, it was PO number 108. Most vendors don't like it when you submit a duplicate purchase order number. So if I'm going to reorder these parts, then I'll answer yes to that question. It will generate a unique purchase order number. So now I can resubmit it to our friends at NAPA. One last piece as far as POs is concerned. If you're never going to receive against a PO, then make it go away. Because as the system goes to generate suggested orders, be it through an auto build or any other means, it will not attempt to order a part that is already on order. Meaning, if it said, well, you know what, I need 4 of those to bring you up to your model stock of 6, and it already found 4 of them on order, and it will not put it on the newest order. If you're never going to receive against that initial order, then all we do is highlight the PO, click on Delete. Confirm that we did intend to delete it from that window, and now we're just back to a clean PO management window, only that interstate purchase order still outstanding in terms of what needs to be received against. With the X in the upper right-hand corner, I said there were 4 ways. The last of the 4 is through transfers. Now, if you look at the transfers window, again, the layout of it is almost exactly the same as the purchase orders window. The only difference is, as opposed to doing a transfer out, supposed to do an auto build and or a manual build, we're going to do a transfer out or a transfer in. Earlier today, we found out we had a customer that needed a set of 4 tires. They were available over at our store in Riverside. And so I want to go ahead and post a transfer in. They are sending us those tires. So all I'll do is I'll select the Riverside store. In my case, that's the only one I have available to transfer from. I'll click on OK. We'll go ahead and go into Add Parts. And in my case, it's going to be an HANK 1010338, I believe. Let's see, of course, I typed the part number in wrong. How about a 1010383? Dyslexic today. So there's the part. I don't have any of them on my shelf. However, I'm getting 4 of them coming in from my other sister store in the general vicinity. So once they receive, I go through the exact same process like we did with receiving a purchase order. I'd come in here, I'd flag what was received, I'd post it, creating both the receipt against the PO to increment my inventory, as well as creating my outstanding AP transaction, because in theory I now own the Riverside store almost $400 for that set of 4 tires that I transferred over so I could sell those to the customer. So again, the 4th way to go through in the inventory module would be to use the transfers functionality. A couple of last reports that we'll look at in terms of those 2. Down at the bottom, there is a transfers report. There's also the history purchase order report. So if either one of those, if you'd like to be able to go back and review what's been done previously, both available in the reports menu. On the X in the upper right-hand corner, a couple of last pieces we're going to talk about as far as inventory is concerned before we call our webinar finished this afternoon. Starting with, I skipped over the icon there that says Browse. Browse really serves 2 purposes. When I bring up the Browse window, it's essentially a spreadsheet of my inventory. It's a little more than that, Let's just use that as our example or our comparison. If I wanted to go over and I wanted to look at, let's say, my oil filters, if I scroll over, I'll eventually find the column for department. And if I was to go up to the header for that column, you'll notice my arrow turns into a black down arrow, where if I right-clicked, I can tell the system I'd like to filter. I'd like to filter for department equal to OF, or oil filters. I'll click on OK. And then now, here are the oil filters that I have in stock. When I said there were really two different reasons for the browse functionality, the first would be to make changes to a wide variety of parts in a relatively short period of time, meaning as opposed to going into inventory, view edit, searching for the part, clicking on edit, if I wanted to change the selling price of all of my oil filters, I could simply come in here and say, well, that's going to now be $7.99. As soon as I click into another field, then the system locks in that change, and that value has been changed. Or I'd like to enter in some stock to and reorder values. So I didn't stock this one previously. I'd like to have 6 of them on my shelf. I'd like to reorder when I get down to 3. I'd like to have 4 of these on my shelf, reorder when I get down to 2. So I can make en masse changes to records in my inventory relatively quickly without having to jump back and forth. One exception to that rule, and that is the on-hand column. If I come into this on-hand column and I click on it, you'll notice it highlights the value that's there. However, I can't modify that value. Again, a little tough to convey via webinar and phone call, but what you'll notice is I am trying to change my value. I'm hitting numbers on the keyboard, backspace or delete. The browse window locks out your ability to change the on-hand. And that's because whenever we make a change through any of these other tools up here, or even when we sell a part, we keep an audit trail of the movement of the part, meaning why did that adjustment get made? If we were to allow you to change the on-hand value in browse, we wouldn't continue, or we wouldn't keep that audit trail of the change, and therefore that data then becomes invalid, seeing as there's values and or items missing. But so you could change, again, whether it's reorders or stock twos or prices, want to put it into a different department. Virtually everything else in this window is available for you to modify as we go through. Again, it's that value, that number sold, or that's on-hand value that is locked out. We won't change that value here. The other piece to browse, or the other purpose to it, is to be able to create custom reports. I'd like to see all of the oil filters that I have on hand that cost me more than $5. So I'm going to go back over to my average cost field. I'm going to right-click on that value. I'm going to tell the system to filter, and I'd like it to see where my average cost is greater than, I said, $5. Click on OK, and now it filters the information down, and I've got a smaller subset. Here are all of the parts that are where the average cost is more than $5. I'd also like to see which ones I have on hand. So over to the on-hand column, we'll do a filter again, and the on-hand is greater than 0. And now, again, a much smaller subset of parts. These are all of the oil filters that I have on my shelf where the cost is greater than $5 and the on-hand is greater than 0. So again, if I'd like to be able to run that, then I certainly can do that, adding those filter queries as we go along. Now, what I'd like to look at is a report. So if you look at these values down here at the bottom, part number and description are already lit up in red. If I was to go ahead and right-click on the column header, you'll notice search, sort, filter, reset, and the very last one says custom report settings. I'd like to include this field in the report, whatever the retail or selling price to the customer would be, along with I'd like the cost. So again, continuing to enter in those values. I'd like to see what are my reorder and stock 2 points for those. So continuing to just select the column, and you'll notice at the bottom of each, as I'm selecting the column, that column turns to red. It's now included in my report. I'd like to not only see the on-hand, but I'd also like to calculate the sum. So when I click on OK, what you'll see is that this column will be bolded because it's now going to be a column that we sum as well as display. The last option says blank out field. You can take any numeric value and blank out the field. And what that does is, as opposed to printing the actual number, it will just print a line. So again, if we're going to use this as a count sheet, then I can go ahead and enter in the count of that information on that line as we go along. Once we click on OK, well then now it's got all the different columns as well as the filter parameters that we wanted to have established. If I'd like to run this whenever I want, I could go ahead and I could do what's called save this layout. This was oil filters on hand greater than $5. So if I wanted to come back in and run this report, whether it was tomorrow or 2 weeks from now or 2 years from now, all I would do is I would enter into the browse function. I click on browse, and in that window, when it comes up, I'm going to restore a layout. In this case, it's oil filters on hand where they're greater than $5, and I'll just click on restore. And it now looks at whatever my data points are that day. It applies the filter criteria, meaning, again, oil filter, on hand greater than 0, cost greater than 5, and it will still also include here the columns that I wanted to have included as part of that report. So again, you can build custom reports through the inventory module. If I just wanted a printed copy, I certainly could print it. If I'd like to export it, that's at my discretion as well from the print preview window in the upper left-hand corner. Over to the right, two last icons, we've got global pricing. Global pricing is a way that we can adjust all the pricing for a subset of parts in our inventory at once. As opposed to going through one by one, you could say, well, I'd like to do all of my oil filters. So if I went down to filters, dash oil, or I could define a range of costs that I could include. What supplier that should come from, and or whether I can just do it for all costs, and then should I base it based upon the current cost, in which case price 1 will use what's called smart pricing when it's enabled. Price 2, 3, 4, and 5 will use the default multiplier from the department, provided there is one configured. I could also say, you know what, I'd just like to make it 150% of the current selling price. So if it sells for $10 right now, when I update the price, it'll be 15, 150% of the existing cost. So global pricing allows you to make changes en masse to your inventory using not only smart pricing for price 1, but price 2, 3, 4, and 5, and whatever permutations of either the cost or the cell you have applied inside of the system. Last piece is our reporting window. So as we started out our conversation, it was, why was this important? One of the things that I said was, well, you might want to figure out how much inventory you own. Something like a part stock value summary report or a part stock value detail report. Only difference between the two is this would tell me I own $1,000 in oil filters. This would tell me you own $1,000 in oil filters, and here are the numbers, the quantities, and the costs which make up that 1,000. So again, inventory can give us that type of information as well. If we look through the list here, a handful of other reports that are there. A couple others I would like to point out just as we finish up our conversation. Down towards the bottom, you've got what's called a parts usage report. Parts usage report is a good report to be used to identify either fast-moving or slow-moving inventory, meaning if I select it, I could tell the system that I'd like to see parts that have sold at least this many. So if I said, let me see everybody that sold 6, and when I click on print, it gives me a year and or a date parameter where I can tell it, look for the last year, for example, for all the parts that have sold this many. So if I wanted to, I could use the parts usage report. You can also do it in reverse, meaning I'd like to see parts that have not sold. For example, you know what, I want to see those slow-moving parts. I'd like everything that I haven't sold 3 times in a year where the part is on hand. Those are parts I'm not considering to be fast-moving enough to generate a space on my shelf, so I'm going to consider my options for getting those things out of my inventory and or not replenishing as we move forward. So again, the parts usage report down there at the bottom, another very usable report in the inventory module. And the last piece that I'll point out before we finish our conversation is the very bottom icon in my list, which says tire reports, which different than any other report in the system, regardless of the module, because as opposed to actually being a report itself, this is actually a submenu. I click on tire reports, and it gives me the ability to select which tire report I'd like. Do I want it by size, by supplier? Do I just want the detail of all the tires I've sold, as well as it allows me to look at what's called what is all tires sold or inventory tires sold only. What I mean by that is if it's all tires sold, then the report will include any part that was on a transaction where the department assigned the part was part of my tire group. That's how it identifies those parts as tires. If I use the one that just says inventory tires sold only, then it will only look for parts that have a part record in my master inventory. And again, those would be the ones that then get included on that report. I'm going to hit cancel to close back out of there. I'd like to thank everybody for attending today's webinar.